Hello and welcome to another GiantSlayerTV how to play video. Today our analysts will be diving into how to play Fabled for patch 11.4. As we're moving away from the previous reroll meta, it's a good time to look for consistent compositions to climb with. While there were some nerfs to the Fabled champions, the composition overall is strong enough to top 4 consistently. We'll be covering items, champions, traits, and the general game plan for each stage of the game. With all that said, let's dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our GiantSlayerTV social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Before we dive into how to play Fabled, let's first answer the question, what is Fabled? Fabled is the new variation of Vanguard Mystic that we have in set 4.5. Previously in set 4 it was all about Ahri, but with Ahri gone, we now look towards Neeko as the primary carry. Since she's relatively weak without Fabled, that means you're going to toss in Nautilus and Cho'Gath, both of which are strong frontliners with crowd control. The next question you may ask is, what does Fabled bring to the meta that makes it worth playing? Basically, as mentioned in the intro, it's consistent at hitting top 4 placements. Thanks to the defensive nature of the build, it usually doesn't get completely wiped, so you're never taking harsh losses. This means your health won't go down too quickly, which is important to placing in the top 4. In addition to that, it does have a decent win condition by 3-starring Neeko and Nautilus. These two can elevate the build into a top 3 and even potentially a top 2. Generally speaking, those two champions are rarely ever contested, so you're usually safe to 3-star them. Lastly, Fabled is not something that you have to hard commit to. You can begin playing it in the mid game and still pivot out of it if you want. The items can be a bit sketchy to use in other builds, but Dragon Soul is a flexible enough synergy that you can pivot into it by giving your Neeko items to Aurelion Soul. The fact that you don't have to fully commit to Fabled helps a lot in a meta that's moving towards favoring flexible play. And with that, we can move towards breaking down how to play Fabled. Up first, let's cover the items that you'll be looking for when playing it. Overall, you're not going to be pressed to find specific items when running Fabled Vanguard Mystic. Defensive items and items made from Rod are, in general, good enough to get by with, but there's definitely a few that are worth considering. For starters, you can focus on the beginning carousel. Grabbing a Rod can be a strong choice, especially since it's less contested than other components. Chain Vest is another good option since it builds into several defensive items that are good for Nautilus. Another benefit for getting Chain Vest or Belt is that you can use them to potentially build an early Sunfire Cape. Sunfire is easily the best early item that you can have when considering Fabled as a potential comp later on. It has good stats with solid damage, plus the healing reduction will be helpful later on. Other components to consider are either Glove or Tear, both of which can be difficult to procure in later carousels, so having one of them right away is an okay choice. Now let's get into the items for your primary carry, Neeko. Neeko is pretty flexible, but obviously wants AP items to boost her damage. Jeweled Gauntlet is easily the best damage item for her, though it may potentially limit your pivot options later on. But since it provides a huge boost of damage for Neeko, it's definitely a top priority. Besides Jeweled Gauntlet, you can look for healing items like Hextech Gunblade or Hand of Justice. Hodge is better all around, mainly because it's an item that you can make early game and is used by a lot of different champions. Hextech does provide more consistency in terms of damage and healing, but isn't a necessity, so between the two, Hodge tends to be better. Infinity Edge is an alright choice since it does pair well with Jeweled Gauntlet. Blue Buff or Shojin are also solid options since you do want Neeko to cast often during a fight, and both items help with that. Lastly, you can always pick up a defensive item like Quicksilver or Guardian Angel, but keep in mind the comp has a lot of inherent defensive stats to it, so Neeko is usually going to be safe enough. Next up are items for Nautilus, which are basically just defensive items. As mentioned earlier, Sunfire Cape is a top tier choice. Other options include Bramble Vest, Dragon's Claw, and Titan's Resolve. Any of those are viable, as the main goal here is to make Nautilus ridiculously hard to kill. Besides items for Nautilus and Neeko, you can look to grab a Shroud or Zephyr for additional utility. Beefing up your Yuumi can be great as well, though don't prioritize items for her. Instead, look for generally useful items like, say, a Chalice or Locket. And the last item to talk about is the Vanguard Spatula. Since Vanguard is the only trait in this build with a Spatula item, it can open up a lot of possibilities. For example, you can easily hit 4 Vanguard, 4 Mystic, and 3 Fabled on level 7 with a Vanguard Spatula. It's great on Cho'Gath, but honestly it's not the worst option for Neeko, as she'll get ridiculously hard to kill with it. All in all, the items for Fabled are quite flexible, so don't sweat too much on finding perfect items. Alright, let's talk about core champions and traits for Fabled. Right away, the most obvious core trait is Fabled. Along with Fabled, you're going to want Mystic and Vanguard since Neeko is a Mystic and Nautilus is a Vanguard. All the pieces fit smoothly together with these 3 traits. And while having 4 Vanguard and 4 Mystic is ideal, you can go heavier into Vanguard or Mystic depending on your lobby. Keep in mind it will depend on your chosen in those cases, so the default composition will be 4 Vanguard, 4 Mystic, and 3 Fabled. Neeko is the primary damage dealer, though the whole board is contributing towards damage since the composition does slow damage. Nautilus is technically the secondary carry, but he's mostly used to stall out the front line as long as possible since he's hard to kill thanks to his Fabled buff. Cho'Gath is a necessity to round out Fabled unless you have a chosen Fabled, in which case he's the one that gets left out. But since he does provide a lot of crowd control, it's usually better to have him on your board. The other Vanguards to look for, ideally, are Aatrox, Sejuani, and Ornn. This will make your frontline have an insane amount of crowd control. As for the Mystics, besides Neeko, you should aim to have Yuumi, Zilean, and either Shen or Janna. Having Shen opens the door to Adept if you do go to level 9, while Janna makes your board less frontline heavy. Generally, Janna is easier to 2-star, so you'll likely end up using her more games than Shen. And that's it! The composition is quite simple to run, just make sure you're finding Fabled champions. When it comes to what chosen to run, well, it really depends on what you hit. Ideally, you want either a Mystic or Vanguard as the chosen, so you can have 4 of each plus Fabled units at level 8. Neeko or Nautilus as a chosen Fabled are alright options, but it does mean that you'll be skipping Cho'Gath, making it less than ideal. In terms of which unit is best as chosen, the priority should be Neeko, then Nautilus, then either Yuumi or one of Sejuani or Aatrox. It's not a hard rule to follow, it really just depends on what you're able to hit. If you're not able to hit any of them at level 7, you should consider looking to pivot into a different comp at level 8. With items, champions, and traits covered, let's break down the general how to play the early, mid, and late game, starting with the early game. Since Fabled is not the type of build you usually hard force, the early game can be played standard. Look to pick up and play a strong board of 2-star champions and whatever chosen you're able to find. Keep in mind that with the chosen changes in 11.4, you can always buy an early chosen and sell it later. While leveling aggressively is fine to do, your goal is not to find an early Neeko. Neeko is a really weak 1-star unit, especially without items or Fabled. Nautilus is an alright choice since he serves well as a frontliner. But in general, you won't be pivoting into Fabled units until the mid game, so don't worry about finding them early. Kindred with Spirit and a frontline is a great way to play stage 2 and 3 as a precursor to running Fabled. Kindred can hold on to Neeko items, and Yuumi is also strong in the early game. Overall for the early game, just play standard with a strong board, ideally keeping your health high. Moving on, let's talk about the mid game. The mid game will begin around level 6, sometime between 3-1 and 3-3. You may need to roll during stage 3, but again, you're not really looking to pivot into Fabled Vanguard Mystic just yet. If you have extra gold to pick up Neeko, it's fine to do, but don't play her unless you manage to 2-star her. What you should mainly be looking for when rolling at level 6 is a decent carry like Kindred with a solid front line. Once we hit stage 4, it's time to level to 7 on 4-1, and this is where the transition begins. If your board is weak, you may need to roll down around 20 or 30 gold, otherwise you can slow play the early rounds of stage 4. The goal is to find the Fabled champion, specifically Neeko 2, while bolstering your front line. Mystic isn't as important at this stage of the game, so mainly worry about hitting a strong front line. At this point of the game, you have 2 options, either stay on level 7 and slow roll once you're back to 50 gold, or work towards hitting level 8. The win condition for Fabled is Neeko and Nautilus 3, but you don't have to immediately begin rolling for them on level 7. Instead, assess how strong you are relative to the lobby and determine if hitting level 8 is viable without losing too much health. Remember, the strength of Fabled is how defensive your board is with high armor, magic resist, and crowd control. This means you're really going to have huge losses that result in a lot of health lost, but if you're playing greedy, you may end up losing more health than you should. It's all a matter of experience, but the safe way to play is staying on level 7 to roll. Another important thing to keep in mind at level 7 is Ornn. If you can find Ornn, toss him in as soon as you can. This means you can begin farming artifacts right away, which will help a lot in placing higher at the end of the game. Of course, it's much easier to hit Ornn at level 8, so that's another factor worth considering when debating between staying on level 7 or leveling to 8. And now we can move into the late game. The late game is quite simple for Fabled, as your main goal is to hit Neeko 3 and Nautilus 3. Yuumi 3 is an alright option, but don't hold on to her too much if it's costing you a lot of gold. Leveling to 8 if you haven't already is the other major goal of the late game. Level 8 is where you'll be able to run 4 Vanguard and 4 Mystic. You can also play 6 Vanguard and 2 Mystic if the lobby is heavily favoring physical damage. A less common variation is 6 Mystic, though that does require a chosen Mystic. It's also viable to pivot out of Fabled once you've hit level 8 if you haven't hit enough of your core comp. Let's say, for example, you're able to find Aurelion Soul 2 and other Dragon Soul champions, you may want to consider pivoting towards that instead of sticking with Fabled. Aurelion in general is the best pivot option you have, so always keep that in mind during the mid game and early into the late game when you hit level 8. Besides rolling for 3 stars and leveling to 8, there's not much else to worry about in the late game. Position as needed, but the only concern you should have is making sure your Neeko doesn't get cheesed out by something like a Zephyr or an Aatrox pull. Otherwise, the composition kinda just plays itself. Even getting to level 9 is really not that much of a concern since you're rarely going to hit it, as most of your gold will go towards 3-star Neeko, Nautilus, and maybe Yuumi. Overall, keep in mind the theme when playing Fabled is to stall out fights to reduce the amount of damage you take per loss, which will naturally steer you towards a top 4 placement. That's all for today's video, folks. The latest patch really shook up the meta, so it's nice to have a solid, simple composition to lean on, like Fabled. Let us know in the comment section below if you've been enjoying the latest iteration of Vanguard Mystic, or if you miss having Ahri as the main carry. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.